Hey, Craig.
Hey Simon, what do you got for me today?
So today we are going to talk about why it took so damn long for surgeons to adopt basic hygiene practices that would save their patients. So, and when I say long time, decades. So, like basically thousands, tens of thousands, or even millions of people died unnecessarily after humans should have known better and had discovered all the basic hygiene practices that they would need to stave off infections.
And so, I mean, so you're talking about like when you say like should have known better, you're be like people are like we have now built a microscope and we look at these tiny things and we know what they are, and here's how you stop people dying from infections. Like
Well, more or less
the
that.
science was there.
Well, the science was there. There had been lots of evidence presented. Papers in famous journals had been published. So
Okay,
the
yeah,
information was out there, but doctors were extremely slow to adopt the
hmm
practices that were recommended in the journals.
yeah, okay, yeah. So like the science is there, but adopting like best practices based on the science evidently was not as simple.
Yeah. And so
Okay,
just to kind of like gauge like where we are today versus then, my guess is that I'm pretty sure you've been to the doctor. I think you've even had some surgeries or minor surgeries and stuff like that.
yeah,
My guess is when you last went to the doctor, you probably saw signs around about washing your hands. Probably when the
hmm
doctor entered, they washed their hands either outside the door or once they got in.
You see signs about washing your hands in like restaurant bathrooms. All employees must wash hands. It's not just like hospitals.
yeah,
Everybody does it now.
but especially in hospitals,
Yeah, yeah, of course,
they're
yeah.
pretty vigilant. I'm
hmm
especially when you did your surgery. I'm guessing, based on what I've seen in the movies and TV shows, is once they wash their hands, they don't touch anything. So you'll see that image of the surgeon holding their hands up
Yeah.
while the nurses are doing stuff around them because they're very careful about not contaminating their hands and stuff like that. I would
Yeah.
also guess that when the doctor walked in the room and started either working on you and talking to you or measuring things about you, that they didn't start pulling utensils and tools from their pockets from their previous patients. Like they didn't like take out a thermometer that had just been in their other patient's mouth and stuck it in your mouth,
Not that I noticed, no.
or even use like a bandage, like a bloody bandage that was previously on another patient and put it on you.
That definitely not. I would have noticed that. I would have asked a question about that.
Yeah.
And you were actually there when I received the injury for my one surgery.
Oh yeah, I do remember this. So we were
It
working.
was it was when we were working at the warehouse and I broke my finger with a box of fireworks.
Yeah, I remember that. I was the one sitting in the emergency room for 3 hours for that. I didn't realize you got surgery for that. I just assumed
Oh
they.
yeah, you took me to the ER. I totally forgot about that. Yeah.
Yeah,
Thanks, Simon.
I didn't realize they sewed you up. I thought it was just like probably just putting resetting the bone and then putting a
Well, no,
cast
I
on
had
it.
to go back. I had to go back later, and they put a pin in it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And then the final thing is, I'm willing to guess that when that surgeon walked in the room, that he didn't have like a coat that was like splattered with blood and other bodily fluids from his previous patients.
That he did have, but it was fashion. He got it at Urban Outfitters. It only looked like blood. Yeah, he was a steampunk doctor. So
Yeah. So
yeah.
luckily for you, you were not born in the mid 18th or mid 19th century when doctors were regularly doing these things, even though they should have known way better. And we're going to talk today about why it took so long for them to actually get their acts together and
Okay, yeah.
stop like reusing bandages and scalpels and stuff like that that were used on their previous patients. So before we jump
See, I
in.
knew they did that, but I didn't know about they should have known better. I just thought they just didn't know. They were like, we don't know why infections happen. It's probably God or something.
Yeah, yeah. So,
Here's a tincture of cocaine and morphine. It'll make you feel better.
yeah, and
This is medicine in 1850.
we'll talk about why what the evolving thought was about germs and stuff like that, and how they eventually reached the conclusion that they were
Okay.
quite dangerous. But before we do that, what's the name of this podcast?
The name of this podcast is Momentary Experts.
Yes, and you can get it wherever you get your podcast, and also find it on YouTube.
Cool.
So, before we start talking about antiseptics and hygiene, we're going to take like a sharp right turn
Hmm.
but it's all going to come together and make sense. I promise you. So we're gonna
Okay.
actually going to start by talking about like what surgery was like before the invention of anesthesia.
Hmm.
And anesthesia is a good kind of gauge to compare the antiseptic and hygiene
Yeah.
discussion too, because they were sort of invented around the same time, like around the middle of the 19th century. So you haven't had as much experience as I have with surgery, but could you
No.
could you even like gather a guess of like what surgery was like before anesthesia was invented?
Well, so I think the first anesthesia was ether, right?
Yeah.
Because yeah, like I remember the cider house rules. That's what like Michael Caine like overdoses on because he's like yeah he's like into ether. I don't know. I'm guessing if they like were really bougie with it, they'd give you a slug of whiskey or something to like kill the pain. But otherwise, I don't know, just like hold you down while you screamed.
Yeah, so
Um,
surgery was an incredibly ghastly affair. In fact, it was thought of at the time, before the mid 19th century, that the best surgeons were basically sociopaths. Like they were like cold stone, unfeeling sentinels because
well, yeah, you'd have to be.
yeah, you would have to be because you would have to have the ability to ignore the blood curdling screeches
Hmm.
of your patients and have to sit there and like cut into them while they were basically like frothing at the mouth.
Yeah.
Because it was just so incredibly painful to have surgery. In fact, I don't know how well I can share screens here, but let me see if I can just very briefly do it. Um, there are these like famous paintings of amputations. Um, let's see. Can you see my screen right now?
Yeah.
Yeah, and so
He is
this is
not having a good time.
yeah, this guy is not having a good time at all. He's surrounded by one, two, three, four, five, six, seven people who are all
Yeah.
basically holding him down while he has some kind of clamp around his leg, and presumably that's what's being amputated. Is
Yeah.
is the leg? So it was a pretty ghastly affair. So the the
That's gnarly.
the screen share stopped, right?
Yeah, I
Yeah.
did.
Um.
So that was
So
like a job then, was like, what do you do for a living? Oh, I hold people down while they
yeah.
scream and they have their bones sawed through.
Yeah, my guess is that there were
It's a living.
My guess is that there were clamps and stuff like that, so not every
Hmm.
single surgery had to be that kind of because like obviously if someone's holding you down, they're going to be still moving. Like you probably had to have people sitting pretty still. So I'm guessing that there was some kind of
Yeah.
clamping involved. That was just one of the for dramatic effect, I guess for the painting, that's what they did. So very ghastly, very very cruel. Back then like surgery needed to be incredibly quick because you think now of like these surgeries that happen like 13 hours or something like that.
Yeah.
Like that didn't happen back then. Like surgery was like optimized for expediency. And,
Hmm.
and it wasn't just not just the surgery itself, but the time between you were informed you were going to have surgery and when the surgery took place. Because like patients weren't stupid. They knew what was going to happen. And like you knew that like you were probably in for the worst experience of your entire life. And so like there was like this entire philosophy is around like you couldn't tell a patient they needed surgery and then go send them home to wait 3 weeks for the surgery to happen because like obviously the psychological effect of that would just be astronomical.
Hmm.
So basically,
Yeah.
oh,
I just looked it up. So like an amputation takes depending on where it is in the leg, between 1 and 3 hours. But like 1 hour is the minimum. But that's just for the surgery part. That I doesn't count like prep, sedation, getting everything ready, right? So it's really like an all day affair.
yeah, and my guess is back then it was a much quicker affair, just because they just needed to get through it so quickly.
Hmm.
Also, like surgeries on like basically any of the most vital parts of the body were just like they couldn't happen. Like obviously amputations could happen because those were on the extremities, but like
Hmm.
sort of like anything in the abdomen, the chest, the head was sort of off
Oh
limits.
God, yeah, you're right.
Because like could you imagine like brain surgery without anesthesia, like literally being strapped to a gurney and like having a guy saw through your skull or anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, probably the only thing they could do is like an appendectomy. Like that could be quick enough if like they know where it is, but you're not, I mean, you're like anything going in and like cutting and reassembling and anything like any kind of gastro stuff right out the window.
Oh yeah.
Heart surgery, no.
Yeah, yeah. None of
Yeah.
that. None of that was even. They wouldn't even have bother attempting that. Like, I mean, you think about the heart. Like, you're not just cutting into the skin. You have to break the chest bone. All this kind of
Hmm.
stuff that would have just been like unimaginable torture. And obviously, they didn't have the sophistication to,
Hmm.
regulate blood flow and stuff like that. So most of the surgeries back then were to the extremities or surface level areas, and then dental surgeries were common because that was like something
Yeah.
that didn't really pose like a moral threat to you.
Hmm.
And like prior to anesthesia being invented, doctors experimented with all sorts of stuff like opium to dull the pain, but I mean, opium will sort of knock you out, but it doesn't have the same effect as like as true anesthesia. And obviously, there are all sorts of other kinds of side effects with basically doing heroin prior to you getting like opened up and having surgery.
Yeah, I mean, heroin has a few side effects. Chief among them, though, is that you feel great.
Yeah, that's true.
So, I mean, it would be effective, yeah.
I don't know how effective it would be. I consider myself lucky that I will never have to find out, because my guess is that it might have dulled the pain somewhat, but it still would have been a pretty horrible
Yeah,
affair.
yeah. Um, yeah, well, I mean, and now I think they don't use painkillers in surgery. They just use like either like they deaden the nerves or put you under, and then like opiates and stuff are like for the recovery to like help you manage it, right? So,
So that's what surgery was before anesthesia was invented. So the first public demonstration of anesthesia was in 1846. There was a Boston
oh, really? Okay.
there was a Boston surgeon. His name was Henry Jacob Bigelow, and he was approached by a dentist named William Morton, who insisted that he had found this gas that could render patients like basically free of pain during surgery. So it was just like a few weeks later that this dentist administered his gas during a surgery, and there was like an entire like a group of people watching there, and they basically watched in awe as this guy had this excision of a tumor in his jaw, and he kind of just muttered to himself. He was semi-conscious, but was mostly fine. And
And
then
this was ether?
yeah, we'll get to that.
Okay.
And then they tried it again the next day on this woman who was undergoing surgery to cut a tumor from her arm, and again she was completely silent and motionless. When she awoke, she told the doctors that she hadn't really experienced any pain at all.
Yeah, I mean, that's got to be such a game changer. If you're like a surgeon, you're used to this like horrific, you got to hold people down, the
Yeah,
screaming,
yeah,
the yeah,
yeah,
and then to see people not react to it?
and remember
Yeah.
remember this thought about how shocking it was for the surgeons who, up until that point, had only experienced surgery as this agonizing, screeching
Yeah.
affair, to then sit in this theater and watch as like a patient lay completely motionless and seemingly pain-free as they were operated in. Like how radicalizing that would have been.
Yeah. Do you think there was like one surgeon watching it who was just like, well, that's no fun?
The one sadist in the room.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So this dentist Morton, he refused to reveal his ingredients, but some of the doctors who were in the room, they could smell that he was using ether,
Hmm.
which as you mentioned before, it's something that comes from ethanol. And doctors later, as they realized that there was this potential here, they even realized that chloroform was even better than ether at
Mm.
at rendering people unconscious and during surgery. So
Yeah, I don't even know what ether is. So wait, it's made from ethanol. Isn't ethanol just alcohol?
yeah, it's like a some kind
So
of sub chemical from that.
Oh, okay. So it's like amplified of like the effects of alcohol that can also like deaden pain and like
Presumably,
reaction times. Okay.
I don't know about the enough about the biology or the chemistry
Yeah,
to
I
know
don't
how it
I
works.
didn't even know it was made from ethanol. That makes sense, but yeah.
Yeah. So remember, I said this was in October that that this first surgery was conducted. By mid December, so just a few months later, surgeons were already starting to administer ether to patients in Paris and London, and
Well, yeah, it would make your job so much easier.
yeah, and then just 2 months later, anesthesia was being used in all the capitals of Europe, and by June, it was in most regions of the world. And within like maybe 7 years, like every hospital in America and Britain had adopted,
Hmm.
anesthesia. So like,
It's wild that that idea of less than a year having worldwide adoption because you're talking about you said what
yeah,
1847,
yeah,
right?
yeah. So information spread much.
Telegraphs weren't even really a thing in most places, right? I mean, it took like 2 weeks to cross the Atlantic. I mean, we did not have a system of like global telecommunications. So you got to have people physically traveling.
Yeah,
Here's this thing,
yeah,
right? But it was obviously a great idea. So
and
yeah.
also teaching people the right amount to administer
Hmm.
because
Yeah.
it was kind of dangerous in the early days because there was times where obviously you could be overdosed and accidentally
Hmm.
killed and stuff. So even despite it being somewhat dangerous, it still caught on incredibly quickly
Yeah.
with very little resistance.
Yeah.
Okay, so that was a very quick adoption. There's a new technology. It was invented. Doctors
Hmm.
saw it. They immediately latched on to the use of it and started adopting themselves. And
Yeah.
within a very short period of time, they were all using it.
Yeah.
Basically,
This helps everything. It'll make your job easier. It makes the patients suffer so much less. Everything's better.
yeah, and it reformed surgery overnight and made it a completely
Oh
different
my
field,
God. Yeah,
basically.
can you imagine how many people died in amputations because they were writhing around if they weren't strapped down? And then, like, you're trying to cut, right? So, like, I don't like you're having to do like an above the knee amputation, and then, like, okay, well, you moved around so much that I just slashed your femoral artery, and now you're just gonna die.
Yeah, maybe. I think a lot more, as we'll get into, a lot more people died from the infections from the surgery than
Hmm.
from
Okay, well,
writhing
yeah,
writhing
I'd
away at
say.
run. Okay, so let's
Yeah.
compare this to everything I just told you to the rise of antiseptic. So, what
Hmm.
was surgery like before the invention of antiseptics? So, and this gets to what you're talking about, like germs. Like, when did we even know that germs existed?
Yeah, it's Louis Pasteur, right? He's the dude who like had the microscope, and he's like, "There's these little tiny wiggly things. Let's boil stuff, and it kills them."
Yeah. But before that, like hundreds of years before that, people had long suspected the existence of microorganisms that could
Oh,
cause
okay.
harm. So like people were theorizing that microorganisms existed, but like they didn't realize these organisms could be introduced to a system. They thought that they like it was like called the miasma theory or something like that, where they would just like spontaneously generate. So they say
Mm.
they sort of suspected that there were microorganisms. They didn't know how they worked exactly, and they also thought that they were kind of just like something that sprouted up, kind of like, I don't know if you know this, but humans used to think that like fruit flies grew out of fruit, and it wasn't until a scientist proved that fruit fly by basically putting fruit in a jar and showing that no fruit flies
Hmm.
came out of it, that it was proof that fruit flies were actually introduced to the fruit after after the fact.
Yeah, I didn't know that. I remember something about like a theory that like eels were like born from like mud, that like mud just created eels, and they like grew out of it. Yeah.
Yeah, there are all
But
sorts
yeah,
of
this idea of like things just appear. We don't know how. They just yeah, from yeah.
yeah. So because we had no concept that these microorganisms were like crawling all over us and that they could be introduced and that they pose a danger, surgeons would often just like show up to surgery. They didn't wear white coats back then, they wore black coats, and they would just be covered in like the previous patient's blood. And
Hmm.
it was actually worse than that, because like a lot of times they were like traveling to the morgue and like looking at like during like pathological exams and stuff like that. So they would like literally go and like cut open and be digging into dead people. Then when they were done digging into the dead people, they would go right to surgery without any kind of changing of clothing or washing of hands or anything, and immediately start like operating on their patients.
Yeah, that's a terrible idea.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
And I found this quote: some surgeons even proudly reuse bandages and dressings between patients, preferring not to waste valuable hospital resources. So they were very frugal, these surgeons.
Hmm.
And the science was so bad that doctors thought that pus was a sign of healing. So the existence of the pus that comes from an infection, where your body is trying to seal off parts of your body to protect it from the infection, thus introducing, as it like seals it off, that infection manifests itself through pus. They thought that pus was a good thing.
Oh yeah, probably because just literally every surgery ended up getting all pussy as it was healing. So that just means that your body's healing because when you're always just using dirty ass fucking saws and shit, you're always going to get an infection. So they just thought, yeah, wow, okay.
So by the 1860s, I found this statistic: a skilled surgeon in modern Europe hospital, you had about an 8 in 10 chance of surviving an operation if you were being operated on by a skilled surgeon. But your odds of leaving the hospital alive were about 50-50, and that was because often it wasn't the surgery that killed the person, it was
Oh,
the infection that came after it.
oh, 8 in 10 chance of actually making it out of the operation still alive.
Yeah, but
And
then
then 50-50 of actually leaving the hospital. Okay.
yeah, yeah. And ironically, the widespread adoption of like anesthesia made infections like even a worse problem, because remember what I said before, like doctors before were very like limited in things they could operate on. So like there were a lot of ailments where surgery wasn't really an option. And suddenly, now that the patient could be knocked out, it was like a free for all. Like, oh, they can't feel pain. Let's go cutting open into him and digging into his organs and
Hmm.
trying to remove this like breast tumor or remove this kidney stone or any number of ailments. Suddenly, the sky was the limit.
Yeah, just, being able to take your time at this just awfully executed nonsense is, yeah, actually gonna, I mean, like, at least if you gotta be quick about it, you're like minimizing the amount of time that your dirty ass reused saw is in contact with like a human body. But if you're just, yeah, you're like taking a smoke break, just leave it in there. It's fine. He's not feeling anything.
Yeah. So the anesthesia actually, yeah. So probably many more people died as a result, at least in the first few decades,
Christ.
because of anesthesia. Anesthesia probably killed more people in its early days than actually helped people, even though it did make
Hmm.
surgeons' lives better. So then we get to the invention of antiseptics.
Hmm.
You already kind of a little bit about like Louis Pasteur. So
Hmm.
so he was the one who kind of disproved the spontaneous germ theory, and he basically did it by showing that like liquids such as milk and juice had much lower rates of fermentation if they were protected from the air, and so that's how he basically concluded that there were these airborne microbes that could be
Mm.
introduced to the
Okay.
milk in order to ferment it more quickly. So several decades later, there was this guy Joseph Lister. I'm guessing Lister, Listerine, no connection to Listerine, although it's obviously named after him.
Oh, yeah, okay.
He read about this decades later. He read about the research of Pasteur, and he developed this theory that like, okay, if germs could be introduced to milk through the air, and cause fermentation to quicken, that surgical infections were being caused by microbes from the air and the environment. So he took that he took that initial research and basically kind of took it to its logical conclusion, and he
Wait, I'm sorry. Did you say decades?
yeah, I don't have the dates in front of me, but there was like some time that I think Pasteur proved it in the kind of like slightly earlier in the 19th century, and then Lister picked up on it a little bit later.
It's wild that it even took that long for somebody to make that connection.
Yeah, or that Pasteur
Like if we
didn't.
leave milk out and it's open, then there's things that are getting in it and it's causing it to ferment and spoil. I wonder if that's also happening to wounds.
Yeah, but also the thing to remember is like Pasteur, even though he proved that microbes could be introduced, like the theory of spontaneous generation of microbes continued long after that, as we'll talk about in
Hmm.
a few minutes.
Okay.
So Lister was like, okay, if microbes could be introduced from the environment, how do we rid the environment of these microbes to decrease the rate of infection in surgeries? And
Hmm.
he started experimenting with something called carbolic acid, which at the time it was used to eliminate the odor of sewage. Like it would be poured like areas that
Hmm.
were incredibly smelly from
Yeah.
sewage waste and stuff like that. And so his reasoning in his head, he's like, well, the reason that the smell must be going away in the sewage is because the carbolic acid must be doing something to destroy all those germs in the sewage. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And why have I heard that word before? Like I've heard of carbolic acid. Is it still used by some other name?
I don't know. I couldn't tell you,
Okay.
but
Okay. Yeah.
I would guess it's not used in the way that he used it for
Hmm.
reasons we'll soon talk about.
Okay.
So he starts
But yes, I'm with you.
yeah, so he starts experimenting with the carbolic acid. First, he begins by like, and he got his start like prior to becoming a surgeon. I guess a lot of surgeons started out as wound dressers, so he like had a lot of experience with like putting bandages on wounds and stuff like that. So he started by rubbing this carbolic acid on his patient's wounds and then dressing them, and then he would see that like after he took the bandages off several days later, they were less likely to be infected. There wasn't any pus or anything like that around them. So he's like, okay, well, we need to create like a scalable solution and also figure out how to sanitize, hands, instruments, the rooms, and stuff like that. Carbolic acid was not great to work with. Like it could cause skin to burn. It was just not it was not a pleasant substance. So he had to figure out kind of like the right solution for rinsing instruments and your hands. And he also he developed like a spray that could be sprayed into the air in a surgery room that disinfected the air with like very small amounts of carbolic acid in it. And so he published. So after doing these experiments and seeing like a noticeable decrease in the amount of infections from his own patients, he published his findings in a series of reports in the Lancet in 1867. So
Okay.
if you'll recall, the first public demonstration of anesthesia was in 1846, and the first discovery of antiseptics or publication in a widely read journal was 1867. So in terms of like the grand schemes of history, these were pretty close together.
Hmm.
So did you remember how quickly the anesthesia spread? Where within a year, almost like most of the major doctors and most of the major cities were using it, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So 2 decades later, so now we're getting into the 1880s. Most hospitals didn't even have basic antiseptic practices in place. Like it had sort of spread, the information had spread a little bit, so they might dip their instruments in the carbolic acid, but they still weren't like properly washing down their hands or changing their clothes. They were still reusing materials. Like in all intents and purposes, this had for decades after this publication, and like very definitive data was shown that this reduced infections. The decades later, doctors were just like, just ignoring it completely.
Yeah.
So why? So
Decades.
why is that? So germ theory was still not widely accepted. So you go back to this, like, oh, why did it take them so long from when Fleur originally, proved that microbes could be introduced, and then, Lister then realizing, drawing the connection between that and surgery. But within like 20 years after Lister invented antiseptics, germ theory still wasn't even widely accepted. Like lots of the old, especially the older doctors, still thought that germs sporadically generated, and that their actions had very little to do with anything. The other thing was that like as I mentioned, the carbolic acid was like burned the skin, and it was like really
Hmm.
unpleasant to use. So and this kind of gets to the larger point, is like the difference between anesthesia and antiseptics is like the anesthesia Yeah, it made the patient's life better, but more importantly, it made the doctors' lives better. Whereas
Yeah.
that same dynamic didn't really exist with infections because
Oh, like it made it harder on the doctors. Like there's an extra step. There's more work to do here.
yeah, so like
So
not
I don't
only
want to do it.
yeah, there's an extra step. It burns my skin. It creates an unpleasant odor that waters my eyes, and obviously like it's not like it's with anti anesthesia, like the effect was immediate. Like there was a cause and effect where you're given the ether, the patient doesn't scream. You could definitely tell the difference. But like with antiseptics or like with infections, there was often a huge delay between surgery and the infection death. So it was like harder to draw a causal connection.
Hmm.
And
Okay.
I mean, doctors are subject to the same fallacies of like anybody else. Like think about like that even the modern day doctors who were like promoting ivermectin and what was that other drug that Trump was really into? Started with like a C that supposedly cured COVID.
Uh,
I've
I
complete
know there was the bleach thing.
No, there was like some kind of malarial drug that they claimed had a causal connection, and it was because like some quack doctors were like prescribing it because they just like they would give a drug to a patient and the patient would get over their COVID, and it wouldn't occur to them, oh, maybe that patient got over the COVID because 99% of patients got over it anyway, and they would have gotten over the COVID regardless of whether they got that drug. So like
Hmm.
there wasn't as strong a causal relationship between the disinfectant and the lack of death that followed.
Yeah. Okay.
You could also argue that there were like economic incentives since patients had to visit the hospital twice, first for the surgery and then to treat their infection. So it wasn't, as with all the other screwed up like economic incentives with healthcare, this one didn't necessarily hurt the doctors from a financial standpoint.
Hmm.
And then also, like often the doctors who treated the infections weren't the surgeons who caused them. So it's not so a lot of times the surgeons would cause an infection and then like later the patient would die, but that was some other doctor's problem.
Yeah.
So what
So, like, I'm guessing, like, evidence-based practice, like, the established system of, like, let's have, like, a control group and a variable group, and then, like, compare them, and then we'll publish the results through peer review wasn't really widespread yet as well.
I'm not sure about the history of the scientific theory and when it
Okay.
became introduced and widely adopted.
Okay.
Just that whatever standards for medicine we had back then, they were much lower
Yeah.
from
Okay.
an evidentiary perspective than we have today. So,
Okay.
what changed? Why did we finally adopt these practices that very obviously saved lives and reduced the mortality rate for surgeons? So, to tell you this, I'm going to take another far right turn. Okay.
Okay.
So, when I say presidential assassinations, what names come to mind?
Yeah, President, well, Lincoln, JFK, Garfield was assassinated. I think there's a fourth, but I can't bring it up off the top of my head.
Okay. So, for those three,
Reagan was shot.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So, for those three that were assassinated, how were they assassinated?
They were shot.
They were shot. So, they all died from
I
gunshot.
think they were all shot. Yes.
Yeah, so they all died from gunshot wounds.
Yeah.
What if I were to tell you that James Garfield was not assassinated, that he was merely the victim of an assassination attempt?
I would say that you win the award for Mr. Semantics 2024.
Yeah. So a lot of people wrongly believe that James Garfield was assassinated. So he was shot in 1881. So this
Uh-huh.
is so think of the timeline here. Lister has his Lancet article that pioneered antiseptics that was published like nearly 2 decades before. So just to kind of set the timeline.
Yeah.
So he was shot in 1881. The guy who
Mhm.
shot him was named Charles Gattu, And this guy was like a pretty big loser. He failed at just about everything that he did. And among his many failures is he failed to convince Garfield to appoint him as the minister to France. And because he would not accept defeat, and he was all mad, he figured out what Garfield's like schedule was. And because the Secret Service didn't exist, you could sort of just walk up to the president, wherever he was. And he walked up to him at a train station, and he shot Garfield twice, once in the arm and once in the back.
Okay, yeah.
Neither of those shots were immediately fatal.
Okay.
So Garfield did not, these were not, it's not like he bled out and died there in the train station. Within minutes of Garfield being shot, he was immediately tended by a bunch of doctors, not in some kind of sanitized space, but in the train station itself, who immediately proceeded to start poking and prodding his wounds with their bare fingers at the train station.
Yeesh. Okay. So wait, so he was shot in the arm and the back. So it didn't hit any like major organs or anything?
Didn't hit any major organs, but at least
Okay.
one of the bullets did not exit his body.
Yeah, okay.
So they start poking and prodding and seeing if they can find the bullet. They can't find the bullet, so they take him back to a bed somewhere. I don't know if it's at the White House or where. And they just get freaking obsessed with finding this bullet, which ends up, spoiler alert, ends up being Garfield's downfall. Is that if they have just left the fucking bullet in him, he would have probably lived out the rest of his presidency and might have lived a normal life. I found
Wait,
this.
because wouldn't a bullet, I mean, obviously sort of like then if these people were sort of like obviously not on board with this idea still, but like aren't bullets like sterilized because of the firing, right? Yeah, because it's like
Yeah,
there's like
probably it's
heat and there's
yeah,
explosion, yeah.
yeah,
So
probably.
you can just leave it in there.
Yeah, as long as it's not like causing any kind of internal bleeding or something. Yeah, you can just leave it in
Yeah.
there, and it probably was not causing any internal bleeding because Garfield lived for an additional 80 days. So if there were any kind of vital organs that it had hit, he would not have lived that long.
Hmm.
So I found this quote: 12 different doctors inserted unsterilized fingers and instruments in Garfield's back, probing for
Oh my
this
God.
bullet. And the first examination took place on the train station floor. I mean, you can't imagine a more germ-infested environment. That came from a historian.
So 12 different people fingered his wound with their unwashed hands on the floor of a train station. Just like lining up, like it's your turn to finger the wound now.
Yeah, and
Queuing in on this wound. Oh my God. Okay.
this is a further quote from that same historian. American doctors did not believe in the Listerian theory because they subscribed to the miasma theory, the fact that bad air caused diseases and illness, not germs. They didn't believe in germs you couldn't see. So the doctors are like I said, they're absolutely obsessed with finding this bullet. At one point, they take in a metal detector and start trying to use it to find it, not realizing that he was sitting on a bed with metal springs. So of course, the metal detector was just going off like crazy.
Yeah.
And they were thinking they were finding the bullet, but all the metal detector was really detecting was like the metal
Was
springs
the
underneath
bed.
them. And so,
Okay.
so they just begin they become obsessed with taking out this bullet. They start using scalpels and like opening up different parts of his back and digging into the wound and stuff like that. So it took him 80 days to die.
80?
80 days to die. He was bedridden. He was clutching at chest and wailing pain. He was screaming, this pain, up until the day he died. Had an
Well, yeah.
had an absolutely excruciating death. And then after he dies, they're like, okay, well, let's go figure out where this bullet was. So they do an autopsy, and the autopsy reveals the widespread infection. And it's basically almost immediately clear to everyone that the infection killed him, not the bullet.
Well, yeah, the air in the train station was just bad. Obviously, that miasma just got the better of him, not the the finger gangbang of the bullet wound.
Yeah. So,
Jesus.
so Garfield's death was actually, according to some historians, a huge rallying cry for advocates of antiseptics. Like there was just like,
Mm-hmm.
because obviously the death of a president doesn't happen very often, there was suddenly a lot of media coverage and attention to this issue.
Mm-hmm.
And around the same time, like Germany, those efficient Germans, they began to have kind of like more widespread adoption of antiseptic practices, and because they were pioneering a lot of other medical practices at the time, there was like a lot of doctors who traveled to Germany to train, and so they basically would enter these medical schools in Germany. They would take on these best practices around antiseptics and cleaning, properly sterilizing instruments and hands and operations rooms, and then basically they would go back to their home countries and kind of evangelize these practices, and then it just kind of very quickly caught on after that.
Yeah. Okay.
So in the later decades of the 19th century, the early 20th century, it starts going beyond just like let's sterilize ourselves, but like let's actually start creating things that are pre-sterilized, like surgical gowns and rubber gloves. I think it was in 1890. William Stewart Halstead requested that the Goodyear Rubber Company make a pair of rubber gloves. And those like completely took off and were widely adopted by like Johns Hopkins doctors, and then later the entire world. And then there was a German surgeon. His name was Gustav Neuber. He was the first to establish sterilization and antiseptic methods in the operating room, where the staff, they were expected to wear sterile gloves, gowns, caps, shoe covers, and they started to like basically reorient the entire hospital around sterilization. So that's why all hospitals are white. Why all the like surgical instruments have flat surfaces, making it just like they're made out of metal, so they could be washed and boiled and wiped down. That it would like basically optimizing the entire medical establishment so
Yeah.
that it was as sterile as humanly possible. Easy to clean walls, floors, storage, and other services. And it became kind of like a protocol to wash them with disinfectants. So by the early 20th century, we finally start to adopt these practices that were invented 40, 50 years before. And that's just incredible when you think about the amount of human death and misery and compare it to how quickly anesthesia was adopted within like just a year or two, simply because the people who were adopting it had like the incentives in place to adopt it. And I think it like that this kind of story should tell you about a lot about how we as humans operate, how we work on incentives, how we often come to a solution far before that a solution gets adopted. And there's not that it's not that hard to think of like modern day analogs where we know the solution, we have a scientific understanding of something, and it's just slowness to adopt in the public domain that causes us from solving it. Can you think of anything like that?
Well, I mean, yeah. I mean, COVID and masks and social distancing and people just sort of outright rejecting it is like a modern analog.
Yeah, but
Um,
something even more like that we know concrete what causes it and what we need to do to stop it. Something that's
or just
catastrophic to humanity.
vaccines,
Climate change.
climate change. Okay, I was sticking with medicine,
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
because we were in the, so
I
yeah,
was kind of broadening it out to like
yeah, yeah,
all
yeah,
science. Like we've known,
yeah,
we began to suspect decades ago that
yeah.
that the climate was warming up, that it was human caused, and the exact things that were causing it. I would say within the last 20 years, like the consensus has been solidified, and there is no doubt within the scientific community of what causes climate change. We also have
Hmm.
all like I listened to a lot of climate tech and green energy type podcasts because I started to get interested in it, and I was listening to this one expert who was interviewed, and she said that we actually have all the science and tools we need to get to net zero, like almost immediately.
Hmm.
So it's not like we need to come up with any more like technological or scientific solutions. So the science is there. It's just a matter of adoption, which is going to be incredibly slow. Like we can now generate clean energy cheaper than fossil fuel energy. It's just a matter of getting that on the grid and then reforming the grid so it can transfer and store that energy, which we've also sort of already figured out. We just need to do like widespread adoption. But
Yeah,
because of that, like a lot of scientists are still doubtful, even though we have all the tools at our disposal and the science is sound. There's still a lot of doubt whether we could get to net zero by 2050, which is the global goal.
yeah, it's easy to like, and the wondered this before, the like not enough obviously to have like really gone and looked into it, but like it's it, why had no one ever just even tried like I mean like when people did laundry, they would boil it. It got it cleaner. Let's try that in an operating room. We'll see what happens. Oh, look, it made things better, right? Like evidence-based practice is not really that complex, but like it's easy to sort of like look at things like this like 2 decade long gap of discovering and proving sort of this idea of bacteria getting into a system and causing fermentation and then by extension infection and then still not adopting it. And it's kind of easy to be like, well, people like we're smarter now, we know more about science and we do better, but we don't. And it makes me wonder though, like as a thought experiment here. So if it took like the death of the president, something so newsworthy, something so big to really galvanize this movement, right? Like what is the Garfield's awful death of climate change
Or even
that
COVID. What
would
remember when Trump got COVID and he was rushed to Walter Reed? Like, what
Mhm.
if he had died of COVID? Would that have been some kind of galvanizing effect on his followers to where they would have taken more precautions and had adopted vaccines or something like
I
that?
don't think so. I think it would have been just like ripe for a conspiracy theory that he was assassinated by the Democrat deep state
Okay. Okay. So
because
what
he's coming after the pedophile rings,
So
right?
what? So you're saying what is the what is that catalyst for?
Yeah.
There's actually a novelist. Oh gosh, I wish I. Now that we're talking about this, I wish I had looked it up. He writes like futuristic novels about the world after climate change.
Oh, yeah, the Drowned Cities is one of them, right?
I don't know. I
Uh,
just read an article in a profile in the New Yorker not that long ago.
what's his name? Paolo Bacigalupi?
No, that's not it.
Okay.
Google climate change science fiction author
Climate change
and maybe New
science
Yorker since there was a profile in the New Yorker.
Robinson?
Yeah, Stanley Robinson.
Stanley. Oh, Kim Stanley Robinson.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So he has written a lot
Okay.
about this, and he so to go back to your question, what is the James Garfield event? He theorizes on what that event would be, and basically
Hmm.
there's like a temperature that can be reached even in modern day, where once that temperature is reached, like humans can't survive in it, and I forget what the reason was, but
Yeah,
like
it's called the wet bulb temperature,
yeah, wet
I
bulb
think.
temperature,
Yeah.
something like
It's
that.
the temperature beyond which, even like being in the shade, you still cannot regulate your body temperature, and in a given amount of exposure, you'll die. I think that's what it is.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and there are certain places on Earth even today where humans live where it's already starting to touch on that temperature.
Hmm.
So he thinks that there will be a mass death event of somewhere like India or something like that. So one of his novels actually like reimagines
Hmm.
this like or imagines this scenario where it takes place in an Indian village and suddenly it reaches this temperature and so everybody is rushing to get indoors to get to air conditioning, but because obviously there's a huge strain on the electrical system, all their air conditioners start breaking or their power starts going
Hmm.
out because as a result of that sudden surge of energy use. And then armed people start like whenever they find an air conditioner they start threatening death of anybody who tries to enter the place where they are, and then everybody
Yeah.
starts running towards a lake because their only thought is if I can get into a lake.
Yeah.
But anyway, there would be some kind of mass death where like suddenly in a span of a few hours, like 100,000 people died, and that would be kind of the moment where everybody was like, oh fuck, like this is
I don't
this is
think
a
that
real
would
thing.
do it.
You don't think 100,000 people dying in a single day would do
Not
it?
in India, not in Pakistan. No. I mean, there's one thing that like the first world is really good at. It's not caring about dead brown people.
I don't
I
know
think it would have to be.
if
I
they
think it would
bake
have
to
to be.
death.
I don't think so. I mean, like, how often do you hear about? You know, there was like an earthquake in like a developing part of the Middle East, right? And like a lot of people died, and it's like you don't even remember it by the time you get to lunch because it was on your morning news feed. No, I think it would require a mass death event in like or like Phoenix, right? Like this heat wave hits Phoenix that's just so incredible that like the power grid shuts down and then you get thousands of dead people just in Phoenix, right? And so it's at home and it's in like an affluent area and in a metropolis with skyscrapers where we're supposed to be immune from this. I think that would kind of do it. It would definitely get more like media attention. But yeah.
So economists have a theory about this, like what will be the event, and they actually think it's going to be caused by the insurance industry. So basically,
Mm,
you could deny climate change up and down, but insurers, they're not going to get on board with climate change denial because they're on the hook whenever there's some kind of catastrophic flood or something like that.
yeah.
So like the theory among economists is eventually like there will be a mass collapse of real estate in Florida and other kind of coastal states.
Mm,
And that will be the point at which conservatives can no longer argue with the science because they're basically like arguing against cold, hard math. And you can't use the free market to force the insurers to insure them. So all of a sudden, all these homes will become uninsurable, and
mhm,
then the first like few hurricanes will come by and wipe out those homes. The insurers will either refute because they wouldn't insure it, or if they did, they would go bankrupt, and there would have to be a series of bailouts from the government. And then that but eventually that will be unsustainable, and that will be the final catalyst moment for conservatives to admit that climate change is here and is going to destroy our way of life.
mhm.
Does that theory sound?
Yeah, I mean, I think it sounds sound. I still don't necessarily buy that it's going to be like a galvanizing moment where everyone finally bands together and we fix this thing. I think an equally likely scenario is like, what's done is done, and we couldn't have stopped it, so we just need to like basically like retreat and protect what's ours ever more, like even more, against like the hordes of, because like what I'm thinking about right now is, so you've seen like the political turmoil and social turmoil that like the refugee crisis has caused in Europe, right? Where like a few million people fleeing ISIS, and then also like people in like North African migrants moving into Europe, right? It was like a few million or something like that. And there's like 750 million people in Europe. I don't really know how many. It's bigger than the US, right? Um, and then, because what I'm thinking about is like, like you have this scenario of like around the world, like the wet bulb temperature and mass death events in places that are just too hot to live and rising sea levels. And people live near the coast and they have to go somewhere. So I'm picturing like, imagine like the European refugee crisis of having to resettle a few million people, but amplified by like 100, right?
And then all the anti-immigrant, like you might have like these
Yeah.
far right
So
factions that are starting to like.
I don't think it would be a let's all band together and fix this gang. I think it would be like the horde of brown people that we've been fearing for decades is finally upon us. It's a tidal wave, and then we gotta like just build a wall around the whole damn country and
I'm slightly more
point our guns out
optimistic.
of it.
I'm slightly more optimistic than you. I think that will happen. I think the rise of like climate refugees and anti-immigrant fervor will happen. But I think every year the world gets a little bit more in tune or activated or alarmed by climate change. As just someone who's watching it, like, even like Joe Biden, even though he didn't control the Senate, being able to
Hmm.
pass the Inflation Reduction Act, which was by far the largest climate bill in American history. I think that there is like a widespread global acceptance that this is a huge problem, and I think we're not moving fast enough, but I think it'll accelerate once these events start happening. But I do agree with you that the rise of climate
Hmm.
refugees is going to cause all kind of like geopolitical turmoil and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But you
I
don't
mean, I think
necessarily.
you're gonna see like, yeah, I mean, like the rise of like kind of reactionary right-wing populist movements that like dwarf the current ones that we have.
Yeah, you don't have, and you don't
Um,
have to look at like global, like something as globally as catastrophic as climate change to see the same effects that kept us from adopting antiseptics. Like there's in the medical community even today, especially with like developing countries, you see it all the time. Like for instance, like infant mortality. Like you know, all the developed world just like figured out how to drive infant mortality down to infinitesimally small levels like decades ago. We know the
hmm.
basic best practices, and yet there's still a struggle in the developing world to get these get these doctors and hospitals and to adopt these best practices like
Yeah.
for instance, like one of the leading killers of infants is just like not being unable to regulate their body temperature.
Hmm.
And in the U.S., like you have these like incubator. What are these incubators called that they put the infants in?
Uh, an incubator?
Oh, maybe it's an incubator. Maybe that's the
Oh.
technical term for it. But like it keeps them warm. But like if you're in a developing country that maybe doesn't have reliable electricity or doesn't have
Hmm.
those tools, like they found that it's like a very simple fix is just to put the baby against the mother's skin, and
Hmm.
her own like body heat will heat the infant. And yet
Okay, yeah.
doctors in developed worlds in developed countries don't even do this very basic thing to regulate
Hmm.
body temperature. The same thing is like how cholera used to just kill millions of people because they would just
Yeah.
basically shit themselves to death. Well, there
Hmm.
was like a discovery that if you mix the right mixture of like sugar and sodium together
Hmm.
with water, that you could basically stop you could cause your intestines to be able to absorb water again. And it just like took forever for those like very basic practices of pulling together this simple solution
Hmm.
of like sugar and sodium and teaching it to like like people who lived in like rural Pakistan or Bangladesh and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So I mean
Well,
there were so many things where like we have simple scientific solutions that or
mhm.
same thing with malaria, the basic use of like bed nets and other best practices to stem it off. Like it's incredibly hard in some of these countries to
Yeah.
get these people to adopt like basic bed net practices. So, I mean, this is something that's still prevalent today in the modern era.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, you've reminded me of like one story that I was recently told, um, actually about eggs. So, you know how like, I mean, you buy eggs at the store and like everyone is familiar with the experience of like, have the eggs gone bad yet? Have the eggs gone bad yet? In 2 weeks, the eggs will be bad. And like in Europe, you can just keep eggs unrefrigerated for like a month, 2 months, right? And it's totally fine. And it's because we wash them, which destroys this protective outer coating, which makes them porous, which allows bacteria to get in, which means that eggs spoil quickly. But if you don't do that, if you just have eggs from a chicken and then you just ship them, and then like they're not like scrubbed and bleached, then they'll just keep like for months. I mean, at room temperature, you don't need to refrigerate them. We know this. Everyone knows this. This is not a mystery, right? But so like, why keep doing it? It's just one of those things. Yeah, having sort of like the knowledge. I mean, like the FDA, it's not like they're like, oh, really? I didn't know that. No one ever told me that. I missed that Radio Lab episode. Like they know, but I like just it's but it doesn't sort of like motivate change. Obviously, sort of like how quickly you cannot make an omelet anymore is not nearly as sort of severe as like climate change. But yeah, it's one of those kind of like Bader Meinhof things where if you start, I'm sure like looking around for examples of like we know the science, we have it, we haven't done anything, we haven't like we're not using it. It's one of those things that probably yeah you'll sort of just start seeing it everywhere.
Yeah, and I remember listening to a podcast episode like all the regulations around sell by dates are completely screwed up. They're like inconsistent.
Yeah.
They're inconsistent in between states, and
Hmm.
most Americans don't even understand what sell by means. So we waste like tremendous amounts of food based on these arbitrary dates that are put on foods when in fact they could probably go weeks more without being spoiled. So we're just throwing this all this stuff away for no reason.
If I could do a request I would like to request you to, at a future date, become a momentary expert on sell by dates because that shit sounds fascinating.
Why don't you do it?
Uh, well, okay, yeah, I could do it. I
Okay.
could do it for next week. Yeah,
Okay. So,
yeah.
I mean, no pressure to do that. Like, do whatever you want to do for next week.
Well,
But
I'm
yeah,
gonna do it, Simon.
yeah.
Can't
So,
stop me.
you learned some things today. You learned that we as humans are
Yeah, I did.
will allow ourselves to die at incredibly high rates because
I
we're
learned about the bullet wound finger gangbang of President Garfield, which is just horrifying. And it's weird that I didn't know that story. Like, I feel like that should be in like my weird trivia Rolodex somewhere, and it wasn't. So thank you for that. And I'm gonna tell everybody about that at work for the next week, even if they don't really seem that interested, because I need to share this story. So
Yeah, and I had known some. I probably knew it at some point that Garfield didn't die right away, and it took him some amount of time to die. I probably would have guessed that it was like maybe a week or two, and
yeah,
I would have guessed that it was just that he like eventually succumbed to his wounds. That I didn't.
I mean, yeah, I wasn't shocked by the revelation that he didn't die immediately because often, I mean, well, Abraham Lincoln didn't die for like 12 hours or something like that. And he was shot in the brain. Like it can take a while. The body can take a lot of damage, but the whole 80 days of agony, um, which is would be the title of Eric Larson's book about the Garfield assassination, I'm sure. I did not know. That's wild.
Okay, I think that's all the knowledge that I was able to soak up in a short period of time.
Thank you, Simon. This has been a awesome momentary expert experience.
And,
Yeah, that's so cool.
and I guess I should I should credit Atul Gawande. He wrote an article like back in 2013 that I read and kind of like pulled some of these ideas together. And for some reason, I thought it was like a really good. It must have made an impression on me because it did stick in my brain. So
Hmm.
that was the, even though I had forgotten most of the stuff that was in the article, that was the original catalyst for
Yeah.
me coming
Well,
up with today's article or today's
yeah.
discussion.
Like with this whole momentary expert thing being sort of like an embodiment of the world that we live in, where we can all just fall down a Wikipedia hole as we're falling asleep and become a momentary expert, and then we're sharing it the next day. It's like often that is triggered by an article or a documentary that you saw or read like 8 or 9 years, and you're like, oh yeah, I forgot about that. And then you look it up, and then 3 hours of fascinated Wikipedia clicking later, and you're a momentary expert. So
Yeah, I'm
it's
guessing.
totally within the bounds.
Yeah, I'm guessing most of our topics are things we maybe read one article about at some point or heard one anecdote about decide and then we decided okay
Well,
let's go
yeah.
deeper down that rabbit hole.
Yeah, because if we'd never heard about it, we wouldn't be able to pick it as the topic in the first place. So yeah,
Yeah, I would never have been able to
no,
draw that connection unless it had already been at least somewhat
no,
drawn for me.
that was awesome, man. I'm going to be inflicting that horrible story on so many people over the next couple of weeks. Yeah, and I will tell them that they have you to thank.
Cool. Well, I guess I think I'm going to be around next weekend. I should be. So,
Okay,
but
cool, man.
assuming that I am, I look forward to whatever. Don't get you don't have to do the sell by date thing. Maybe if you maybe do a
Okay.
little bit of digging and if there's enough interesting stuff there. But I know you have like a whole Google Doc of other
Mm.
stuff that you might want to tackle.
Yeah, yeah.
All right,
Um, yeah.
all right.
All right,
Well,
buddy.
we're going to sign off
Thanks.
for now.
Cool. See you next week.